Welcome to Voices of Faith, a monthly interfaith dialogue. I'm Jim Bergdahl. With me today are Rabbi Michael Panitz of Temple Israel in Norfolk, Imam Vernon Fareed of the William Salam Mosque in Norfolk, Father Jim Griffin, St. Mark's Roman Catholic Parish in Virginia Beach, and the Reverend George Neese, a retired United Methodist pastor. Welcome to all four of you, and welcome to our audience. Let's talk about some of the issues that have been in the news recently and how they relate to our various faith groups. The Virginian Pilot recently editorialized on the capital punishment on the death penalty and calling for the abolishment of that. The governor of Washington State just recently indicated that he would issue a reprieve for any case that came before him during his tenure of office. During the last 5 or 6 years, there have been a number of states that have moved to abolish the death penalty. I believe there are now 13 states that oppose such action. Father Griffin, what would you say to that from your perspective in the Roman Catholic faith?
Well, a few years ago, in the reign of John Paul II, he intervened in a couple of cases. One was in Missouri and elsewhere. Even in our Catechism of the Catholic Church, there's a very narrow possibility for the capital punishment being agreed with by the Catholic Church. I've ministered on death row myself, and I know that some of the other issues are whether there should be electrocution or lethal injection, and there are a lot of differing issues. A lot of differing states, as you say, almost 13 have outlawed it. This governor from Washington, I was reading this morning, outlawed it for his own state during his tenure. The Catholic Church sees a very narrow window for the possibility of the death penalty. It's not to say that electrocution or the other is the way to go. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the existence of the death penalty. And the death penalty is seen, first of all, as immoral, secondly, as spitting in the wind, so to speak, against violence, in that you don't kill a person who kills a person to prove that killing a person is wrong.
Would you say that the Catholic Church has an official position of opposing the death penalty?
Opposing the death penalty, although there's a very small window in the Catechism of the Catholic Church allowing it.
What about Judaism, Rabbi Panitz? Is there an official position or?
Well, Jim, in Judaism, as in certain other faith communities, there are different denominations, each of which interprets the basic core of our tradition in overlapping but not in identical ways. And the core of that tradition is itself a story of development. In the Hebrew Bible, there are many, many offenses where the prescribed consequence is capital punishment. For example, in Exodus chapter 21, it says if a man is guilty of homicide, the punishment is capital punishment. But on the other hand, in the course of the development of the understanding of our Jewish scriptures, over many centuries, the rabbis tended to narrow still further the occasions for which capital punishment is the appropriate punishment. Not that no punishment is appropriate, but some other sanction rather than that. The high court in ancient Israel was called the Sanhedrin, which is also referred to in Christian scriptures. And there was one rabbi who said that a Sanhedrin which passed one capital punishment in 7 years was known as, quote, a bloody Sanhedrin. Then the next rabbi said, no, one execution in 70 years classified as a bloody Sanhedrin. So in this instance, the Jewish perspective tends to converge with the Roman Catholic one, although not in the same nomenclature, not in the same theoretical details, but practically speaking, the death penalty in Jewish eyes is one which is exercised very rarely. Case in point, in the modern state of Israel, which is now 65 years old. It's not governed by rabbinic law. It has British and Israeli and some rabbinic input into its legal system. But to date, there has been exactly one case of capital punishment carried out, and that was for the notorious Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. So maybe 1 in 65 years is about right.
Imam Fareed, what would there be an official position in Islam?
Well, in the Quran, it is allowed. Capital punishment is allowed. It is allowed as an option, something that's left open for basically the families. In other words, if the family loses a loved one, they have that option to, and we don't, I hate to use the word retaliation, but as a kind of a compensation or just compensation for the loss of their loved one, that they can exercise that option. However, they are cautioned to not allow emotions to override their decisions. So it's something that is available, is allowed or permissible, but it is to be exercised with extreme caution. And again, it's really a tool that is available for the families who've lost a loved one. Most families, in most cases, will not exercise that option.
I know Reverend Neese can't speak for all the Protestant denominations, but give us some feel. I know there is an official position, of course, in the Methodist Church.
Yes, it is. Through our general conference, which meets every 4 years, and then we have a book of discipline that is published, and the official statement is to abolish capital punishment. And I'm not aware of any exceptions to that, the narrowness that Father Jim talks about, or that the rabbi talks about. I don't think we have that in the United Methodist Church. It is to abolish a capital punishment across the board. So.
The governor of Washington State said when he made this statement that appeared recently that he hoped that we would have a national conversation on this and it would lead to the abolishment of capital punishment. We've talked about this for many, many years. It's been a constant issue. Do you see a swelling interest, particularly now in this over other times? What about it, Rabbi Pennant?
Well, when I think about this in the context of, excuse me, in the context of recent American history, there was a period in time when our Supreme Court held that there were no forms of capital punishment that passed the scrutiny of the Eighth Amendment in the Bill of Rights, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishments. And then at a certain point in time, the Supreme Court ruled that certain kinds of execution would be allowable within that stricture. Now, we should be aware of the fact that the American Constitution is a secular document, necessarily so, and that there are Americans of different faith persuasions, all of whom participate as Americans. And when we do so, our own faith insights help contribute to what we think is the right course for America. Now, I'm not sure if we'll end up with one national standard, but I do know that as it now is practiced, there are some major questions of equity. You know, the same crime in one state, the same crime in another state, and a consequence for the offender, which is an infinite difference. So that doesn't feel like a government of laws the way it should be. So I'm hoping that we would achieve something more of a national.
One of the things that we're talking about, or a few of the things we're talking about, is everything from the Constitution to American law. I think the Catholic Church would see it as a moral issue, no matter what the law is, that the taking of a life is wrong. Now, we're not talking about retribution like you were in a certain sense, but the taking of a life is wrong. It's as wrong as for the state it is for a murderer. That we see redemption possible for anyone on a moral level. That's a little different than the laws of our country might say. I know that I've been a priest 31 years, and I know that 31 years ago, the majority of Americans would be for the capital punishment and for the taking of a life for a life. And I know that has gone down drastically just in the 25, 30 years that I've been a priest. So I don't know whether it's a legal issue, but I know it's a moral issue that life is sacred. That's, I think,
How do
all
you
of
see
our,
that playing out in relationship to the abortion issue?
I see it as the same thing. We have what we call it's not the same thing, but I see it as the same issue, that life is sacred and that abortion is not to be done because it's a life, a human being. It's the same issue in the end. The same issue as any life issue is. We've talked about different ways.
Go ahead.
Excuse me.
One of the other issues that seems to be very much in the news now is the definition of marriage. And two of the Catholic bishops in Virginia have written an editorial recently that talked about the importance of defending marriage. And in the article said, what is at stake is the preservation of the family, the fundamental and foundational unit of society. And they spoke very passionately about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of preserving that. And against that backdrop, we of course now had the discussion regarding the action of the Attorney General, the new Attorney General, in which he said that he would not defend the constitutional amendment that was adopted in 2006, I believe it was, to add to the state constitution, banning same-sex marriages. Is there any unified position of the church, George? What's the position of the United Methodist Church or most Protestant communities?
Well, the position of the United Methodist Church is defined again in that discipline that marriage is between a man and a woman. But there has been some movement in the church to change that perspective and not use exactly those words. From a personal standpoint, in my experience, I would like to see the church, the synagogues, the mosques, the religious community to get out of representing the state in a marriage situation and let the church, the synagogue, the mosques be the official position on the marriage within that community, and not as a pastor to be representing the Commonwealth to do a marriage. If we look at the history of marriage, we see a race issue that goes back to colonial times, and that was the reason for the contract. As far as the state was concerned, and so marriage licenses have not always been part of our religious history, and I'd like to see a return to that.
Father Jim?
Well, one of the things, I guess I'm a reductionist, just like the other argument, reducing it down to a moral argument. It's the same with marriage. Our two bishops, the Bishop of Arlington and the Bishop of Richmond, did write the article upholding only men and women being married in the Catholic Church. And they based it on something that I thought was a little higher than it needed to be. They based it on the fact that ordained by God and natural law dictates that only one man and one woman should be married. I guess I go even further, more basic personally, by saying that first of all, it's perhaps sexuality is ordained by God, male and female, and perhaps that is how we fit together, so to speak. But as you were saying, I don't see that marriage is ordained by God as one man, one woman. I think the sexuality is, but the marriage has to do with communities, has to do with different faiths, has to do with different traditions. I don't know that the argument they used to uphold marriage as between a man and woman was the right argument. I think it was one step above what it needed to be.
Rabbi Panitz, what does the Jewish tradition tell us about this?
Well, let me say that I concur with the pastor. The Jewish word for marriage involves the Hebrew word for consecration. The Hebrew word is kiddushin, from the basic word kadosh, which means holiness. So we believe that marriage is when two consenting adults with the mental faculty to be able to consent enter into this sanctified relationship that involves a sharing and an intimacy, which is therefore, by definition, not available to everyone else. Now, I don't think that's what the secular state is talking about. There are many secular dimensions that the state has legitimate interest in regulating. For example, we have HIPAA laws. Who is a privileged partner to be able to receive sensitive medical information? We have inheritance laws. Who is a presumptive next of kin to receive an estate? Those are not religious matters per se, although religion could speak to them. I personally regret that in the battle of nomenclature, which is part of this culture war that we find, I regret that the term civil union somehow fell into disfavor. Because it seems to me that whether it be heterosexual or homosexual, the state has a secular interest in regulating civil unions. On the other hand, religious faith communities will disagree amongst themselves, but that's okay. We live in the world, and one of the blessings of America is that religious faith communities can be allowed to disagree, and it doesn't bring us to blows. Even within Judaism, I could anticipate that, let's say, the Orthodox denomination would say only heterosexual relationship could classify as consecrated. And I imagine the Reform movement, which is less traditional, would come to the opposite conclusion. But the point is, I think that by having the word marriage apply to a set of different goals, secular goals versus religious goals, we've confused the issue.
So you would say there might be a difference between the civil union, the state-regulated marriage ceremony, and the religious ceremony, whether it's in the Christian or the Jewish? Or...
Yes, and I would also want us to have a sense of being at ease with the thought that different religious faith communities would arrive at different decisions within the religious zone, because that would not be impacting upon the secular interests of society as a whole.
Vernon, does the Quran have anything to say about marriage?
Yes, not only the Quran, but the example of the Prophet Muhammad, praise and peace be on him. One of the things, and I also agree with the position that you took about the faith communities being able to have their own position on that as opposed to the secular community, and not really confusing the two. In our religion, Al-Islam, there is a misunderstanding, and I say a misunderstanding of English terminology, even among Muslims, about what is allowed. For example, many Muslims will say polygamy is allowed in Islam, but not polygamy. Polygyny is allowed. And there's a difference between polygamy and polygyny.
What is the difference?
The difference is polygamy is the marriage of more than one person, but not necessarily of the opposite sex. Whereas polygyny defines that the person that you're marrying has to be of the opposite sex. And I know we don't have time for me to get into that whole ball of wax about the multiple wife issue in Islam, but just to briefly say that it's first of all, the encouragement is that a man would have only one wife. It was a social remedy that was allowed in an idolatrous society, and a society where men had concubines. In pagan Arab society, men had as many wives as they wanted. So in contrast to this society that we live in, it wasn't a going up from one wife and going up to 4 wives. It was coming down from as many wives as a man could want or have, down to a maximum of 4 wives. So it was a reduction rather than an increase, and it's only allowed. There are a lot of stipulations about the qualifications that a man has to have, the conditions under which he can take on another wife, and I know we don't have time to go into all that.
One of the more controversial aspects of this is whether clergy within the faith groups should be allowed to quote, marry persons, same-sex marriages. And I know that's been certainly a controversy within the United Methodist Church and in most Protestant denominations. Is that true in Judaism? And
Who is entitled to pronounce a couple married? In Judaism, there was at first a stipulation that the person so empowered would be an acknowledged master of the body of religious tradition and law. And that became more or less coterminous with clergy. But I think, again, we should beware of thinking of clergy as the agents of the state in the same sense. The imam has brought in a very important dimension that we shouldn't forget because it's broadly applicable. The imam has talked about understanding our sacred scriptures through the lens of history. Now, I'm no expert in the Quran, but certainly a particular provision means something else if you realize what it's a reaction against historically. And that also suggests that when we look at any text from any of our sacred scriptures, just the words alone may not be the full meaning of what they mean. We need to know what their context was. And a case in point, I mentioned the book of Exodus before. There's a verse in Exodus which says, eye for eye and tooth for tooth and burn for burn and hand for hand and so on. But when the rabbis interpreted that, they didn't read it literally. They said the value of an eye is the correct consequence for someone who's maimed his neighbor and caused the neighbor to go blind. And that's much the way our courts figure it out now. What's the pain and suffering? What's the lost wages, et cetera, et cetera. So it's important for us to recognize that we can be faithful to our scriptures even while using reason and tradition to understand that those scriptures don't always mean exactly what the plain meaning of the words say.
One of the things I'm mindful of is that we're trying to define who can be married, and the Catholic Church, as I said before, would say that's a man and a woman, one man and one woman. The Catholic Church also has, at the other end of the spectrum, annulments. And we say who can be married and who can't be married if they've been married before. So one of the things probably needed, especially with the new things being developed governmentally and new things being developed American-wise, is that the Catholic Church is going to have to define not just who can be married primarily at the first blush, but also in our faith, we need to sort of ratchet out who can be married again. You fall in love again, you can't help who you fall in love with, no one can, and that's great. But the Catholic Church has strictures at the end of a marriage, and whether a person is in communion or not, until they get an annulment, or until even a Protestant person who's married and wants to marry a Catholic for a second time needs an annulment. So the Catholic Church is sort of in the business of saying who can't be married, and probably needs to be in more of the business about who can be married, is what I'm saying.
Jim, if I may make one last comment on it. One of the things that disturbs me is I know that there's a movement. Whenever people have an interest in something and they see a movement, well, everybody who has an interest in that object or that objectivity tends to want to join into that movement or support that movement in some kind of way. So there's a movement now for the LBGT community, I think they call it, to get certain things passed, certain laws passed that they have an interest in. The thing that is disturbing and that I don't particularly like to see happening is that people who have different opinions that differ from theirs sometimes are ostracized. They're called haters, and I don't think that that doesn't fit well with me. That because I have a difference of opinion, your sexuality, the sexuality that a person chooses, prefers, or how they prefer to be viewed or looked at or called, that's their business. That's their business. But I have my business. I have my position. And because my position doesn't reconcile or agree with yours, that doesn't mean I hate you. It doesn't mean I'm out to get you. That doesn't mean I don't want to give you the freedom to pursue what you want to pursue, but give me the freedom to pursue what I want to pursue and to maintain the position that I want to maintain.
It's interesting, George, did you have a comment on that?
As a United Methodist pastor, one of my positions was if someone comes to me who is from a different community than one I'm in, do I turn them away or do I work with them and minister to them? Not to set in judgment of whether it was right or wrong, but to work with them. And so I agree with you that,
Well, it's
these
interesting
differences
that,
don't have to be the mark.
Right.
We work with people.
it's interesting, Father Jim, that I think Pope Francis used almost that same logic that talked about George when he said that, who am I to judge?
Who am I to judge their sexuality, and who am I to judge how they live their life? Probably it's a little different than who am I to judge who could be married. If you ask him who could be married, he would say one man, one woman, the first time. But at the same time, who am I to judge in our ministry is what we're talking about, a person's sexuality or a person's differences.
Right. Finally, a word about Pope Francis again. He appeared, of course, on the cover of Time magazine as the Person of the Year in 2013, and has recently appeared on the cover of Rolling Stones magazine. And the headline there was, "The Times They Are A-Changin'." Have you really seen significant changes, Father Jim, since his...
In my life and in the life of our church since he's been Pope in March, I think it was, not really. There's a tone that's different. There's a very open tone, a very down-to-earth tone, a tone which lifts up those who are poor and all of the rest. In my ministry and in the things we're defining, even with our discussion today, there hasn't been that much of a change. Certainly hasn't been any edicts from the top that this shall happen now and it's never happened before. But I think the biggest difference in Francis is that he is loved because he's real and because he's beginning to do things a different way than some of the other, but much more formal and teaching type popes have been. He's much more a person of the people. And I think that's the big difference, not that any great differences in what we have to do and what we believe have happened yet.
Well, we'll have to continue this later. We appreciate very much your being with us today. This has been Voices of Faith and Interfaith Dialogue. Our guests today have been Rabbi Michael Panitz, Temple Israel in Norfolk, Imam Vernon Fareed of the William Salam Mosque in Norfolk, Father James Griffin of St. Mark's Roman Catholic Parish in Virginia Beach, and the Reverend George Neese, retired United Methodist minister. We thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time. We thank First Presbyterian Church in Norfolk for hosting this program. I'm Jim Bergdahl.